Today we're talking about China and how they are affecting global entertainment. I'm sure you're all going to write a research paper on this someday.
There will be a quiz at the end. Pay very
There
close
will not be a quiz. Oh, he's got buttons. I'm kind of waiting for lightning bolt to shock him.
Did he do?
Alrighty, so who here's been to China? Anyone been to China here? Oh, fantastic! That's excellent. All right, so I was in. What's up? Yeah.
Also, Luke, did we want to introduce ourselves?
Yeah.
Oh, that's coming.
Ask the Australians that right now. I didn't mean to laugh after that, but oof. Yeah. All right. So, have you guys been to China?
No. Check.
Well, since you haven't, why don't you tell the fine people who you are?
Oh,
See how I did
okay.
that?
Hi, I'm Will
Segue.
Kunkel. I'm the Twitch overlord for the Extra Credits Twitch channel, and there I host a show weekly with each of these fine gentlemen where we talk about things like global politics and game design and the way that those things intersect in interesting and sometimes peculiar ways.
Yeah. Check. Not yet. Okay, I'm going to talk loud. My name is Matthew Kroll. I'm the showrunner and narrator of Extra Credits. This topic, when Luke brought it up to me, has always been something that I've been passionate about and wanted to learn more of. This seemed like a really good opportunity. He is the expert. I am the pupil, and I've learned a lot. And I'm looking forward to discussing it with them and all of you. And who are you, Luke?
Who, me? I am Luke Peterschmidt. I'm a game designer. I designed a game called Bakugan. Anyone know that? Yeah, so I was that. I designed the first edition of Bakugan. I designed a lot of collectible games. I forgot the giveaways.
Where are they?
They're up in the room. That's fine. Designed an Extra Credits game recently called Extra Politics, and I wrote the Extra Politics series for that channel as well, which is where I met these fine folks. And I'm just fascinated by politics in general and how gaming and politics are connected. Politics are just a series of rules, and governments just have a series of rules to create certain types of behaviors that we want. And the similarities are worth investigating. Mm-hmm. All right. In fact, this topic came as part of one of our every Wednesday Twitch Extra Politics streams. Where can you see those?
Twitch.tv/Extra Credits.
Extra Credits. And we were talking.
S, not a Z. If you're at all familiar with us, our
I don't
YouTube
know why
channel
it's-
has a Z. The Twitch channel doesn't. It's a big disparity.
James is no longer with Extra Credits?
Yeah.
I think there might be a power on
Is
the
there
back
a-
of that. Is there a power on the back of that? No, because you're.
No, it's fine.
All right, we'll make it work. All right. So the reason I asked who here has been to China is because it's a very different place, and a lot of people don't even understand the government of China and how it differs from our own and others. You'll hear it shorthanded as communist government, but it is very fundamentally different from, say, the communist governments of Russia or Cuba. They are really trying to find a line between capitalism and central control. They want a lot of the benefits of capitalism, but they want a lot of the social controls that you get in a more authoritarian style government. And this is a sentence you will hear a lot of American politicians and government officials say in private, but never in public. We don't want America to be China, but we'd love for America to be China for a year. Because China can fix problems top down very effectively. Sometimes we look at these countries with different political systems and we don't see their upsides. When I was in Shanghai last time, I was struck by how all of the scooters were electric. And the person I was there with, the toy company I was working with, told me that they basically made a statement from top down and said, all scooters will be electric, you've got 6 months, go. And it just happened. Companies formed, electrified the scooters. That would take a decade in America. Our window for when we make political decisions is 2, 4, 6 years out. Theirs is decades long. It's a very, very different dynamic. And as such, they have very strong feelings about entertainment. So what do you think China's afraid of? Do you guys have any thoughts on that? I don't want to I could talk for hours on this.
I mean, you could.
What? So
Depending on what those personal opinions are.
Right.
yeah, so China, because they want the benefits of a capitalist society, right? They want exchange of goods and services. They recently, in recent history, allowed consoles, computer game consoles, to even be sold in China. They missed out on like the last 3 versions of the PlayStation, Wii U. I think all 3 Xboxes until now they can get the Xbox One, because the country just didn't want to have that influence. Because culture is part of what they think it's the government's job to curate, right? In America, more Western liberal democracies, we think culture happens. And we certainly do, as a government, try to if anyone who's been to DC here and seen any of our monuments knows that we're trying to present a certain face for our culture. And they try to do the same thing, and they're worried that different countries will try to push forward a different view of what China looks like. And here's the challenge. Entertainment is literally America's biggest export to the world. You might think it's cars, you might think it's not, it's entertainment. And entertainment breeds culture. We define ourselves by the entertainment we take part in. If you define the 70s, no one's going to define the 70s without mentioning the music of the 70s. No one's going to define the 80s without mentioning the music of the 80s and the movies of the 80s. It's how it works. So China does not want to allow into China. Sorry, wow, we brought in a dog. Now we're serious. China might not want this panel to take place.
Bum, bum, bum.
I'm just saying that could be happening. So what has China done to try to protect their citizens from influences that they don't think support the Chinese culture?
Check, check. 1,
Check,
2,
check.
3.
Wait, now does mine work?
Yeah, I think so.
We're in?
This works, right?
We're in? We're in?
Good?
Okay.
We just got to
All
eat
right.
these things.
We're good.
Just got to eat
Yay,
them?
Thank
Woo!
you, Tech. All right.
All right. I still feel like my channel is really low. That's all right.
Yeah, it's fine.
So that's fine. Thank
I mean,
you.
wave in the back if you can hear Luke.
Can you hear me back there?
Yeah. Good?
Yeah.
All right,
Good.
cool.
All right.
Okay,
All right.
cool.
All right. So recent history. Let's talk about the kind of things that China has tried to change entertainment-wise that have gotten into the country. So in addition to doing extra credits, Matt here does a fantastic podcast called The Only Podcast About Movies.
There's an asterisk over one of those words. I'll let you pick where that is.
It's silent. You can't
yeah.
pronounce the asterisk. We get into trouble with that a
But
lot.
there's obviously with more and more of our media being consolidated under smaller and smaller groups, some of them with mouse ears, it becomes interesting to see what caveats need to be made in order to sell media in the Chinese market. There's been a ton of changes, especially to things like Marvel movies, some Star Wars stuff, etc. The big ticket sort of items on Disney's plate that have changed due to wanting to get that market being available in that market.
Can you give an example of some of
A
those?
small thing would be in Captain America: Civil War. Tony Stark, we all know who Tony Stark is. He's a tech guy. He invents suits of armor that let him fly and fight frickin' Thanos. Like, we understand who he is. The phone he uses in Captain American Civil War is a Vivo V3, which is a mid-tier cell phone that you can only get in China. That was a marketing move. That was a thing that doesn't really make sense with the plot. They just wanted Tony Stark, this genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, as he so calls himself, to choose that phone. Because if Tony Stark is using it, it's the best phone. He also gave Peter Parker a pair of glasses that had, drones coming out of the sky. But the point is, that's sort of a small sort of conceit, like, oh, that's even product placement, right? Like, that's not a huge deal. And most people probably didn't even notice that. It only mattered to certain folks.
Let's stop you 1 second. So everyone know what product placement is? Company pays money to get their thing put in a movie, right?
Yeah.
It's why E.T. eats
Reese's.
Yeah.
Pieces,
Yeah.
right? That's one of the more famous examples is E.T. eating Reese's Pieces as opposed to M&Ms or Skittles or anything else.
Yeah,
Yeah, 'cause they
M&Ms
bought it.
M&Ms thought the movie would be a failure and said no. Mistake.
Jokes on them.
So the interesting part about the product placement here is normal product placement, a company approaches a studio and tells the studio, hey, I'll give you some money to do this. In this case, it was almost certainly the Chinese government on behalf of the cell phone operator saying, we want Tony Stark to use a Chinese cell phone. which is a fundamentally different thing because China has the power to say whether you can show that movie in China or not. And I believe it was the highest grossing movie to date. No, Endgame was the highest.
Endgame, yes.
Grossing movie in China.
629 million in China.
Yes. Yeah. So the Chinese market is super important. Now, let me backtrack just a little bit. If you are an American company and want to do business in China, often you have to work with a local Chinese partner, and that means giving up some percentage of your ownership control. There's a slippery slope on intellectual property control and patents. Entertainment, on the other hand, you don't have to do the business in China to sell in China. You can make a Marvel movie with not a single Chinese employee, or not a single employee from Finland for that matter, and still sell into those markets. So the Chinese government doesn't have the same kind of control over Marvel the same way they would over, say, Ford, right, who does a lot of business in China. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
But
so like, again, it's things like that are sort of the small ticket items, but they happen so much that we don't really notice it, but it does sort of have sort of a cultural impact. Then you can come to sort of, I'm going to stick with the Marvel example because for all the crap I'll talk right now, I am a shill for Marvel. I absolutely love the films. The other, one of the largest ones was a couple years ago when Doctor Strange came out. The ancient one, I believe, in the comics, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is supposed to be of Tibetan descent. They changed it to
Tilda Swinton.
To Tilda Swinton, which I'm not even gonna. I like the performance of Tilda Swinton. I don't even mind the direction it took. The issue I have is sort of on the back end where they didn't do that because they thought it would be better.
Right.
They did that because if they kept it as a character from Tibet, China wouldn't play the movie. That's a larger ticket item. That's changing a whole thing around that might adjust your narrative in a way that a stupid cell phone for a character will not. And so when you start getting into more and more of these things, like there's random shots, I think, in it's either Ultron or one of the Avengers movies where like, Iron Man 3 again, where they have to take Tony Stark to China to fix his heart. Like there's these sort of scenes you see that are there, not because they haven't set up the story to better it in that way. Not to say that they couldn't if they took the time to actually do it. They just put these shots in to get enough things having to do with China to make it seem good for the government to sort of let that movie still run. They do small things. The Top Gun trailer recently for the Top Gun Maverick, they changed the patch, the Taiwan flag on Maverick's old jacket from the old movies. They changed it. They took that off the jacket digitally. And it's like, or else you can't show that trailer in China.
Yeah, so China has issues with, for those of you who don't know, with those regions. Taiwan, they believe, is still part of China. Most of the world says it's own state. So these are foreign policy issues internal to China that are affecting Top Gun, the shirtless volleyball high-fiving movie.
Yeah, and there are two other examples which leap to my mind, which I don't know if they made our notes list, but most recently, Wizards of the Coast and the Chandra and Nissa breakup. Spoilers. If you haven't read the most recent War of the Spark movie, there's been a bisexual character in the Magic canon for a while now, and they sort of wrote it off as she had thought better. It was just a phase she was going through, and binned the story arc and moved on. And many people have linked that to expansions into China because that story doesn't play well in China. Similarly, TikTok has recently drawn a larger amount of flack in LGBTQ media here because if you dig through the gargantuan terms of service policy that we all just kind of agree to, right, on iTunes or whatever, and no one ever actually reads it, it's quite explicit that you're not allowed to talk about LGBTQ issues on there because a lot of people don't know that TikTok is one of those joint partnership with as a Chinese company partnering with other companies to sell their product overseas.
Hard air quotes all around.
Yeah, TikTok is not really, TikTok isn't the product. The content that people make on TikTok is the product. It's a strange balance.
Is China one of those countries that has no gay people? Is that the one, or is it North Korea?
Yes.
Is it Iran? Is it Iran? Yeah. Somebody made that statement the other day, and it was... Yeah. Yes. It was laughably ridiculous. All right, so that's movies. for those of you who follow the NBA, recently there was a NBA general manager of the Houston Rockets. He put out a tweet supporting Hong Kong, which is having its own issues with mainland China right now. Hong Kong is a fascinating story that we could talk about for a long time. It makes no sense unless you dig deep. But he tweeted support, and China canceled streaming of the preseason games, had all of the sponsors who sponsored just the team, the Houston Rockets, cancel their sponsorships of the team. The NBA didn't really back down from that one as much as, say, Hearthstone did.
Yeah.
But they did say those were not the views of the NBA, which is normal for the NBA. The NBA, of all the U.S. pro sport leagues, gives their players the most freedom to take political action and speak politically, and so they make a similar statement like that all the time. This is not the position of the NBA. It's just this one player or one whatever.
For a little bit of context on that, Luke, how much is that deal worth? That deal that just got the plug pulled because one general manager sent one tweet. We're not talking about like a large number of people. We're not talking about a lot of people with signs or protests or any coordinated actions. This is one person sending one tweet, and it was...
I believe my notes here say a lot.
Yeah. The estimate is in the billions.
Yeah, it was a big number because NBA is expanding into China.
Yeah.
So, and that's a, I mean, so targeted and such a large amount of money that...
Yes. So the NBA has 800 million fans in China. For perspective, we only have 360 million people in our country. So if you're wondering why they have that level of power, right? That's a lot of consumer power right there. All right, let's talk about games specifically now.
Yeah.
So someone cover the Hearthstone thing.
Sure. So who has played Hearthstone? Recently.
Not recently.
Okay, good. All right, cool. We're on the same page. So that's why it bears explaining, right? Hearthstone exploded big, and as part of its esports coverage, they do have a global tournament series. In this, it is not uncommon to interview players after particular keystone matches. It's a sort of a 2-monitor setup, right? The players play from all over the place, and they sort of remote in to have these interviews. And it's pretty standardized affair. You know, I played Warrior because this patch, Warrior got a 5% win rate buff against handlock and whatever. But in this case, a player by the name of Blitzchung took the opportunity during this interview to make an extremely politicized statement in favor of the protests going on in Hong Kong. The loose translation that I recall is
Liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our time.
Right.
I have that written down.
He screams this into the microphone. Okay, cool. Blizzard's pro player policy has a line that clearly states no using Blizzard resources to advance your political agendas. So Blitzchung got pulled from the Pro League. Okay, he's in violation of his contract with Blizzard. And then they fired the casters who were interviewing him. And that's when this went from being something that's about the pro player policy to something that we wanted to talk about more in like the segment on China's influence, because the casters didn't do anything. The casters, when they realized what Blitzchung was doing, were actually ducked down like behind the monitor. The shot is sort of like this shot, except they've got big chunky gaming monitors, and they ducked down behind them so their faces could not be seen while Blitzchung was saying this, and they got fired anyway, despite having no control over the statement that was made.
Yeah, Blizzard also tried to claw back about $1 million or $600,000 of his winnings.
That's correct.
Which they eventually gave back.
After a rather large and immediate backlash, with a very large number of people deleting their Blizzard accounts entirely, canceling ongoing WoW subscriptions, refusing to buy into new Hearthstone expansions, and similar things.
Yeah, so interesting here is, why did Blizzard have that policy? The NBA doesn't have that policy. The NFL doesn't even have that policy. Right? Why is it that Blizzard decided to put a policy in for their players that says you can't make political statements while you're doing a thing? Right? Well, who owns them? Let's see. Is Blizzard part?
I believe my notes say there's a little company somewhere.
Act Blizzard? Is that Act Blizzard?
Yeah,
that's 5% owned by Tencent.
And
Yeah.
Tencent. They don't seem like a big company. They don't own a huge percentage of Epic,
So this
Riot,
all of
Ubisoft,
Riot.
Paradox.
So you're China. Let's just play this out like you're a gaming company and you're trying to win the game of control what my people see. And you can't control the content because you want your people to believe they're part of a first world, which they absolutely are. But you also can't say you can't make your product in my country because we don't own half of it and have control, because this product's being made all over the world. So they've bought this one company, Tencent. It is the largest company in China. It's the 9th largest company in the world, right? It's ahead of some. I wish I could list the 8 above it, but you know the 8 above it: Google, Amazon,
Facebook,
right?
Apple.
I mean, it is a massive, massive company. It owns all of Riot. It owns 40% of Epic, 5% of Blizzard, 5% of Ubisoft, 5% of Paradox, right? And that 5% might not seem like a lot, but for publicly traded companies, that's enough. You start to get legal rights at 5%. You get more rights at 20%. So they are very interested, and I don't want it to be depressing here. So let's talk about what China has done, I think, right in the video game space, because I think they have done a lot right.
With that ability that you sort of described before, with the ability to pull things off relatively quickly because of the way they are structured.
Yep.
Yes. So they put an 18-month ban on all new computer game sales. Now, I think the ban only lasted 9 months before they retook it up. But they did this because they felt things were getting out of control. And they had a lot of data to back that up. They came out of that 9-month thing, 18 months, but they cut it short and said, okay, we're going to let some new games in, but all micropayments are now being maximized for the month. So by age. So I think that's like $28 and $54 a month is all you're allowed to spend on micropayments in China based on how old you are. If you're a child, maybe adults are different. And for those of you who in the industry, that's massive because the micropayment industry exists on people that spend $1,000 a month. So they just shot all the whales in the head and said, you can't do this anymore. They also have instituted time-based options in computer games for parents. So you can tell your kid, or the country can actually tell the kid, you can only have 3 hours of computer games a day. And I think there's 2 different time lengths there. So we have a problem with our toxic community online. And what do? We sit around and we argue about it endlessly and do essentially nothing. Maybe China did too much too fast, but I don't think you can say that we're on the right side by doing nothing and they're on the wrong side by doing too much. There's a spot in the middle there somewhere where effective action can be taken. All right. So let's talk about the size of the market real quickly in China. We sort of touched on it.
This is where it got me real. No, continue on. It's just this is the
Yeah,
part where
this is
everything started to click.
Yeah. There are more people in the Chinese middle class than there are Americans. If you look at the definition, one definition, larger definition has the Chinese middle class at about half the size of our entire country, which is still bigger than our middle class. Our middle class is like 50% of our country. So you're a publicly held company. You've grown as big as you can grow in the United States. You are judged on one thing and one thing alone, and that's growth. Where is your growth going to come from? It's going to come from China and the rest of the world, but China mostly. So these companies are making very rational decisions to do business in China if all they care about is making money. How many people think here companies mostly care about making money? Yeah, I mean, anyone who owns stock here certainly hopes their company cares about that, right? That's what your retirement's based on. We don't even view that as unethical anymore. We just view it as differently ethical, I think.
Yeah. Differently.
Ooh, I like that phrase.
No, that is a bad phrase.
Well, it's only bad because you're differently ethical than I am. So, Avengers Endgame did $850 million in the U.S., did $630 million in China. Go back 2 decades, that number is 0 in China, or very, very little, right? So that Marvel movie made $600 million more than it would have a couple of decades ago because they made changes to a movie. Let's see what else we got size-wise. Oh, yeah, there's more computer game players in China than there are all Americans. So think about all the Americans you know, every mother, father, grandfather, 1-month-old baby. There are more people playing computer games in China than all of those people put together. It makes sense to give them what they want. The challenge for us in a country that has the First Amendment and believes in some inalienable rights, What we're really giving them is the product that their government wants us to give them, not the product that maybe they want. And that's where that ethic's not differential enough. Fate of the Furious did more money in China than it's in the U.S. The Vin Diesel car driving franchise is huge over there. Did 225 in the United States, did 300 and almost $400 million in China.
Also a mediocre ride at Universal Studios. I don't know if has anyone ever done, sorry, I just had a tangent. Anybody, Universal Studios, Florida, Fast and the Furious ride. No one? Just me? Okay, moving.
Okay, so what does China actually want to stop from happening? Specifically, they've made some things pretty clear currently. No negative images of Chinese history. They don't want Chinese villains who can be easily defeated. That's why none of them new Bond villains are Chinese.
But they can be defeated. This has to be, they cannot be easily defeated?
That is the official line.
So there's some gray area there.
Yes.
Right.
From a narrative perspective.
Well, we could talk about a trailer that just dropped, right? And a lot of people have mixed opinions, right? The new Mulan trailer, right? Where's Mushu, right? They changed the villain, right? And so I think that there's two sides to that argument, right? And I think that that's another case where it's a lot easier to see. It's a lot easier to see a different perspective on that, right? If you go back and watch the original Disney's animated Mulan with a critical eye, it's really racist. It's hopelessly racist. The bad guys are literally gray-skinned, yellow-eyed devils. It's really racist. One of the most sacred symbols in Chinese mythology, the dragon, is turned into a goofy Eddie Murphy sidekick. Right? And so it's easy to see it's much easier if we look at it through that lens to see the perspective of we want our culture to be respected by people who are trying to use our people to facilitate their economic growth, right? And so it's not a clear-cut case of, I think the word that a lot of people would choose to apply to the way that China treats some of these issues is censorship, right? But I think while that term is technically correct in the broad sense, we do need to look at a lot of these minutia and look at the way that look at the reasons why policies like this came to exist, and some of them can easily be seen in an example like Mulan.
Yeah, that trailer looks amazing.
And I really dig the new trailer.
Good. Yeah, so I've been guilty of this too. I used to work on a product called Legend of the Five Rings. It's a feudal Japanese fantasy world. And when I was the brand manager of Wizards of the Coast, we said, hey, you know what? We just got this Pokemon thing we're doing. Maybe we should talk to Japan and see if they want to carry Legend of the Five Rings. And the Japanese people who looked at it are like, wow. Like, you literally have a clan house called Fanboy, translated, which I didn't know we had. They're like, this is like a 12th century helmet and a 6th century breastplate. And I'm like, okay, well, have you seen what we do with our medieval history with the bikinis made out of chainmail? I mean, is this? And they're like, no, this would be like us making, like the Japanese made a Western and giving the sheriff the name, Clint McHamburger. So we can all.
Wait.
I'm copywriting that.
I would watch that.
Hamburger.
Yeah. So
I think they did that. I think it was called Blazing Saddle.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So it is. Hopefully, we're all getting better. That was more than a couple decades ago at taking appropriate reverence to the source material that we use. Although we did cut out all the stuff we knew was bad in Japanese history. Like
you can look at the L5R. Fantasy Flight owns it now. They've rebooted it as a living card game.
Yeah. The card game, the Legend of the Five Rings card game. It's it's great. It's one of the greatest games of all time.
From a game design perspective, it's really cool. And we could talk about that for like an entire other hour. But we're not gonna.
We're not gonna. No. All right. So no negative stereotypes of Chinese. No weak Chinese villains.
Yep.
Which you just should stay away from. Now that was where they started, but it's clear they've gone a step further with things like the phone, mandatory inclusion of Chinese actors in large budget films. So I don't remember what the character's name was, but there was a very well-known Chinese actress who had a really bit part as a tiny Marvel superhero in a background shot. Like weird, like the highest paid actress in China shows up as a character that none of us know, even if you're a huge comic fan. And she was there just because they said there's not enough Chinese, actresses and actors. And to be fair, I'm sure in China there was a longer cut where she had a longer scene, and I'm sure they billed her on the placard promoting the movie.
Yep.
And this isn't China alone, we should say, that censors what can go in. You can speak to how Extra Credits deals with like swastikas in Germany. Like, you all know that you can't have a swastika online in Germany, right? You can't show that image.
Yeah.
I just said it, didn't I?
Yeah, I mean, you did, yeah, I mean, and there's certain choices as groups and as content creators that you can make because like for instance, there's in multiple countries even at this point, right? Is that the case? Like, it's just like that's just something that A, they don't want to proliferate, and B, it shouldn't proliferate. So good, like there's a lot of even going back to sort of the correction of the Mulan thing too. Like you can see a lot of this from the two sides of it, where it gets muddy is sort of the when you buckle down to sort of the whys of changes and the whys things are adjusted and how content is changed even on micro levels or macro levels, and you get to the financial structure of why that is, being that companies' goals are to make the most money all the time whenever money can be made, and not enough money is enough money. That's when you take what might be something that could be a benefit to a society, Germany not allowing swastikas, and you turn it into something along the lines of, well, you can't release this movie here if you don't have this, and this. By the way, you need this phone. By the way, you can't portray anyone but a heteronormative character. Like, or that's not even the correct term. But like, you just that's when it gets scary, and that's when it gets bad, and so it is complex beyond sort of the good and bad of the idea.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. And another example of like the EU has very different online privacy rights than we do.
Yep.
Right? Like, they have decided that certain types of things you can't do online and you shouldn't be able to do online. Libel laws, it's a huge issue for a lot of people. And we're going to get into more of this with deep fakes, like what's allowable and what's not allowable to be shown. Most of those decisions are made because the people making them believe it's bad for society to make them a different way. So that is the thought process going through what's happening in China, the bad for the Chinese society to let them go in a different way. So not to be super downers about all of this stuff, I would be really curious, asking my panelist here, what they think's going to happen in the future.
You want to go first?
Sir, I live on the internet. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I think we're going to see a point where we're going to get a big, we're going to get a push comes to shove battle at some point over companies and more, I think, relevantly to most of us, artists' rights to portray their work in the way that they intend, and sort of the right of a government, or the idea of a government, to control the media that its people consume. And if I had to guess, and this is a big guess, I'm guessing that my gut feeling is that we're going to get a showdown between the mouse and China over something that we don't expect. I think Disney, recent statistic, right? 80% of all blockbusters last year were produced somewhere in the Disney tree, right? Now, it's not difficult given if you look at the past 10 years, all of the things that Disney has bought for itself, like a mouse-headed dragon on a pile of old film reel. But it is, I think that's where we're really going to see something happen. And I don't care to speculate on which way that pivots, because we're trying to keep it light in here, and I don't have Scott's beach balls to put up.
That's
so
fair.
I'm just going to...
So I want to bring about Devotion real quickly. You guys familiar with what happened with Devotion? It's an online game by a Taiwanese developer, and somewhere in one of the shots was a reference to Xi Jinping of China and Winnie the Pooh, which is a thing that he doesn't like. He gets compared to Winnie the Pooh. That game was removed from distribution in China, and then was removed from distribution entirely. So I want you to remember that when you edit content, even sometimes small people can't get their stuff done. If China owned Steam, there'd be a real difference in what you could actually play. So this kind of changing of content doesn't just affect people in China. It doesn't just change our movies a little bit here.
And I think we should bring up, too, there's a point that we haven't really touched on in the notes, which is that sometimes it's not an artistic decision. Sometimes it's a geographical one. So sometimes, if you list the wrong thing as a country, there are repercussions. So one of the examples that we have listed, at least in my notes, is that the Marriott website called Taiwan a country on their booking system, and China took them down for a week. No one in China could book, that's a huge market, could book a Marriott hotel for a week. All of that business gone, right? And of course, they can say it officially, right? They could say, yes, we took your website down because you made this error, and that's not in line with our understanding of the world. Or they could just say, oops, I tripped on something. Either way, they were down for a week. And that happens with games, too, a lot of the time, right? Think about when you're declaring region for low latency, right? Most of us are familiar with US East versus US West. Sometimes you have to play on a UK server, or if it's the middle of the night and you can't sleep and you really want to play a game, you have to play on an Australian server or whatever. But sometimes they're delineated by country, and games have been taken down as well for having the wrong geographical unit listed there. So sometimes it's not even an artistic choice. Sometimes it's a technical choice, which leads to these things happening.
Going back to the future stuff real quick, and then I think you want to open up the Q&A right after this.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say one sort of quick thing on this. Again, in no way, I'm learning this along with everybody here. Luke's been a great resource at all of this information, but like sort of gleaning it, going over it, talking about it right now. As far as the future is concerned, I just, maybe I'm not the optimist, but I do not see corporations changing the end goal of the most money as the most important thing.
Insert shot from Finding Nemo of the seagulls, except instead of mine, they're saying money.
No, sure. So if that's the case, if we're going to say that that's probably not going to happen, that's going to be, let's give it a 2% chance, so let's not even sort of discuss it. What's the next thing that could possibly happen to have this not proliferate further? I would argue maybe that it would have to be some sort of sort of sanctions on companies. This is a weird type of thing, so it's not even the correct wordage, but like, if our government said, hey, we don't really like what you're doing to appease this other government, and then put things into it like negative effects for doing that, that might have something. But then you go back to the numbers, and if the numbers are way higher in China, most companies will be like, deuces, and just be like, gone. So I don't know if I have yet to, in my brainstorming, be able to come up with something. So honestly, that I kind of want to be the first question I ask to everybody else, is do any of you see any, even if it's half-baked, because Lord knows mine was, possible solution even down the line that could possibly happen?
Can't the World Trade Organization do something?
Okay. Well, follow up real quick. I saw those hands. I saw those questions pending. Who knows what the WTO is? The World Trade Organization?
Who here's protested the WTO? That's about the only time you ever see them on the news.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Can
the WTO do something? Almost certainly not. The people, because of digital distribution, and every country has the rights to what comes in and out of their digital distribution pipeline, they can basically do whatever they want to digitally. It's how they can make sure Twitter doesn't happen. Anyone who travels to China knows that they lose a lot of their internet privacies when they go there. So it's extremely tough to do. The WTO was World Trade Organization was mostly set up to deal with trade that happens on boats between large countries. Right? I mean, they could try, but I don't even know how they would deal with that.
How might China change its restrictions with JavaScript on the rise and more and more games starting to be written where a person can just set up their own private website and just put a game out there? can they monitor and police
Yes.
hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of potential games?
So I'll get nerdy real quick for a hot second on this. There's a world in which China has a lot of internet access control, right? That's not a secret. This is known, right? One of the reasons that many people who travel abroad in China invest in VPN software is so that they can access the internet without the restrictions that China puts in place, and that works to a certain degree. However, for Chinese residents, that's not an option. The way that they would get around that, if that were really something that they want to do, and I don't know the details of the Great Firewall of China, is they'd change from a blacklist to a whitelist. The idea being that instead of saying these things are not permitted, they would say that only these things are permitted. And that's a pretty easy way to change that. So there are technical ways to do it. The question is whether or not they would want to. And based on what we've been talking about, I can almost certainly say that they would want to. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Either, yes.
In front first.
I was going to propose maybe one of the solutions to the issue would be to break up companies to be specifically regional within the country that they're doing the business in.
So the suggestion for the people in the back who didn't hear it would be to break up companies into different versions. So in your world, so let's take China out of it, right? Because that, whether or not we like it, that politically charges the conversation further than I mean it to, right? So let's say that Facebook has Facebook Canada and Facebook US, right? There's a lot that goes into mandating that they do that. And that's like an international law thing, right? Because they don't.
Can I jump here?
Yeah.
Actually, you can, and eBay does that.
Yeah.
So eBay has eBay UK, eBay Germany, eBay rest, right? Now, most of those businesses are based on the idea of I am selling a physical product to someone in this area, so they're trying to collect their taxes. But German eBay does not allow swastikas on it, and American eBay does. So they sort of do that.
Right, but the
I think
we're going to argue about this on Wednesday.
Sure,
you know,
sure.
We're just going to argue about this.
Tune in on a Wednesday, extra politics on the Twitch channel, and we'll argue about this. But
Yeah, go.
So we have a lot of growth still to do in this country on LGBT issues, but you're mentioning TikTok, like, doesn't allow that content.
Mm-hmm.
I think as America progresses on those values, especially if Disney ever releases any character or gets pressured to release characters that are LGBT,
Yeah.
that could be your flashpoint between China and Disney having a
Sure.
especially because all the male actors there are gay and work there. Trust me.
Sure. So the suggestion would be that I can speak today, I promise. LGBTQ issues might provide the flashpoint between a Disney that cares about those issues deeply as part of its core value structure and a world that wants them to not do that. I think fundamentally the problem that we still run into there is that anytime we talk about an ideological value, right? We're placing that ideological value up against the core purpose of a company, which is to generate revenue for its stockholders and its employees, right? And so like that has to be such a strong clash, right? And so one of the reasons we kind of touched on this, but we didn't really. We've seen backlash from American consumers cause change, right? It's not as hopeless as like maybe it sounds on the face of it, right? Blitzchung got his prize money. His suspension got slashed in half, I think.
Yeah, it's 6 months.
Yeah, it's 6 months instead of a year, right? Because people spoke out, right? So I think that continuing to speak out about the things that we believe in will generate change. I don't know it'll cause the flashpoint, but I do think that it should be a priority for all of us that have core values that we think are not being respected by companies, is that we should continue to speak out and vote with your dollars.
I want to riff on that flashpoint because I think there's actually a way I think that could happen. I think if Disney decided to make a movie with some LGBT characters who and said, you know what, we're making this movie, it's never going to show in China. China won't let us, we don't care, it's not showing up in China. But it's a Star Wars movie. Right? They edited out the same-sex kiss in the last Star Wars movie for China. But maybe they make it a China, maybe they make it a Star Wars movie or a high-budget Marvel movie. and people in China get it anyway. Like if the draw is so high on that content that it could cause a break where it gets to China and their society doesn't collapse, and everyone's like, okay, whatever, wasn't that big of a threat. Like you missed the boat on what was really a problem here.
And kind of, I'm going to take a little bit of a literal and figurative middle point on this entire thing. I don't think it would be it's not Disney's not going to do a Star Wars or a big ticket thing in that lane. But because they're literally expanding so much, they're going to have their super big blockbusters, and their middle movies are going to have smaller things. They have their Disney Plus series. So I think what could happen in that scenario is a character in one of these sort of lower to mid-level budget, let's say, things has an LGBTQ main character, and it just fucking hits. Like it takes off, right? Yeah. And then everybody is talking like this is the next big thing.
It's Baby Yoda.
I was going to say
Baby Yoda.
Baby Yoda confirmed. Right? Pan.
Right.
Moving on.
Going off on that, I mean, then that is the way if we want to get to that, because then people will demand it, people will pirate it, people will go, and if enough of those sort of things sort of get there, that might be how that gets there.
Or if China overreaches and says, Disney, we're not going to have your new Star Wars film in our country if you still make that, even though we don't get it.
Like remember doing a connection.
Yeah, remember the NBA thing? The NBA got in trouble for what was posted on Twitter, something you can't even get in China, right? That was them saying to the NBA as a company, we don't want you acting that way in your own country, or we won't take you in our country.
Yeah.
All right.
I think I saw Slytherin sweater. Yeah.
So going back to the idea of solution and kind of hearing in on this conversation, I think the solution is going to come from the Chinese side, and it's going to be whisper campaigns and black market, because the black market's huge in China, and word of mouth, we can't even. American culture can't even understand word of mouth of how much it does. Just look at the Chinese thing. It's crazy the amount of influence that word of mouth has, and that with the type of society, the population density that they have. So it's going to come that way. We're going to continue the LGBT thing from the early, late 2000s, early 2010s. Yaoi was huge in Southeast Asia, in Germany, in Europe, in America, and I was there in 2010, and it was it's not allowed because homosexuality is forbidden. There's only a few public figures that are allowed to kind of be homosexual, even though it's not a crime, but you still have to register as a homosexual. But you could still find it, but it would be packaged and contextualized in a different way. So it's going to be something like that, where the Chinese people are going to come up and find a way to their national
Mandate.
And sometimes these are generational things.
Yeah.
Sometimes it will take a whole generation being raised that doesn't have a problem with it before the rest of people go, I guess it wasn't something to worry about.
And there's a whole other, I could probably do a whole hour panel on this, and we've talked about it some in previous political discussions that we've had. The evolution of technology to empower political change is increasing as our access to technology does. Regardless of whether or not you agree with the practices of the protesters in Hong Kong, right, in their ability to cause civil unrest, one of the incredibly undeniable things is that it is one of the first major protests that's being led without centralized authority figures or distribution of information, because they're using airdrop. Right? And mesh networks and the way that technology works and evolves, and as that gets better, right, we'll be able to do more of that, right? Imagine a world where I can airdrop you the latest Marvel movie. Marvel hates that, right? Yeah. Marvel absolutely hates that world and doesn't want it to exist, and Disney doesn't either. But the technology will come to a point where it does exist, and it will be the way that that's implemented to create that world.
Yeah, I mean, just showing the effectiveness of their protests versus the Occupy Wall Street protests.
Yes.
Right, is
Occupy Wall Street was the last big sort
Analog.
of in-place
Yeah.
analog, and the Hong Kong protest has been described as being quote-unquote like water.
Yeah.
Well, we should probably get...
We got time for more.
Yeah, we got time for a
some in
couple
the
more.
back there.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah, so going back to the Flashpoint, it's actually something that's already kind of happened with Cartoon Network and Steven Universe, because gay characters getting married in an episode where something incredibly interesting plot happens. I'm not going to spoil it. But in Russia, they give Ruby a mustache, basically. And then they realized that there was no way that they could fix it because Ruby's wearing a dress.
So they made it better. What I'm hearing is they made it better.
So
What ended up happening was Steven Universe just got banned in Russia.
yeah. So I know South Park made a pretty strong stance against some stuff in China recently too. I will say, just if there's people who want to make games here for a living, there is a huge opportunity for making pro-Chinese games. And I don't even mean I don't mean propaganda, right? I mean just find an awesome thing that happened in Chinese history and make a freaking awesome game. And there's 800 million gamers out there who want to play it.
Total War Three Kingdoms comes to mind. In the tie, in the back there, you.
So no, now, just going back to the whole Marvel, Disney redesigning characters thing, like you brought up the H one and all that, but now we're getting the first version of that because Black Widow movie is coming out, and this is the first major live action adaptation we've had of Taskmaster. But they've had to completely redesign his character because in his comic he has a skull-based mask, and since China has some weird superstition thing about not showing skeletons, they've seen the trailer and it's like, oh, that looks literally nothing like Taskmaster whatsoever. Why did this happen?
Well, and the Black Widow movie is getting it from a bunch of angles because it's a movie about a Russian KGB operative set in Russia with characters with Russian accents that we're going to try and market in China. So that's just sort of like snowshoeing through a minefield there.
Yeah.
Which means it's going to be interesting. We'll call it interesting.
Yeah.
Let's spread these around. I think I saw you. Yeah.
Can anyone name any positive aspects from China's growing in Russia? Besides
Oh yeah.
They fund.
Yes.
Okay. So
it seems like we're talking about a lot of losses, a lot of
Sure.
So it comes across that way, I think.
The money cannot be underestimated.
Right.
I mean, it is a lot.
And the
of
money can do good things, right?
Yeah.
The question becomes whether or not we're willing to accept an industry in which that money comes with asterisks.
And just an avenue. What we really don't want to see is the avenue closing off for games or other entertainment to try to make cognitive points about what's going on today. Like the first X-Men movie was about AIDS, right? Like it was a science fiction movie about something really important that was happening today. And if we can't use our art to make those statements and maybe point out what's wrong in our society, we are losing something. Now, we're not doing that in the Star Wars. Star Wars was never making those statements.
Right.
But the worry is when it gets down a few levels and we lose that ability. But man, the money cannot be underestimated. I mean, the budget for a AAA film, we didn't know how we would ever pay for these things because they were getting $250, $300 million budgets. That takes a lot of consumers to make back $300 million on a computer game.
So then, as far as the positives go, then are we like?
We're gonna get more powder puffy, cotton ball, like less serious things.
more and more of our ability.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, on a macro level, there will always be like, okay, so I stream on Twitch, right? I am pretty critical of some stuff. To put it mildly, when we introduce our Extra Politics series, right? Luke is sort of our left of center voice. We have a right of center voice, and I'm eat the rich.
Yeah.
Right? So like on a micro level, right, I can still be critical and we can still be critical, right? It's just the problem becomes that when we have a world where Disney makes 80% of the blockbusters in a year, right, we have to make sure that we're not losing that critical edge to our art, right? When they're making that 80% to also sell to other places that don't share in the same desire to challenge the norm that we do.
I was listening to a DJ talk the other day, and he said that every revolution has had a soundtrack, right? And the soundtrack is sometimes music, it's sometimes the printed word. The worry for governments is that soundtrack can be entertainment. So it is not unreasonable for governments to worry about that. Your hope is we can get to a world where there's so much entertainment that governments are okay with 0.3% of it being critical of a thing that they love, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I can keep doing that. I see a bunch of repeats.
We got time for
Oh,
one
yeah,
more.
well,
Back Star Wars in the back we haven't got yet.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. We
yeah.
can only see the
I can only see
star.
the star.
It's
Hey, it's
Wait,
deceptive
hold
on
wait,
purpose.
Stand up and show us that it's the Wars font.
Yes.
It says Star Trek in the Wars font.
That is
Go
the
on,
greatest
it's
shirt
you.
ever.
The Chinese censorship happened even to other movies, like in Bohemian Rhapsody when it came out. Freddie Mercury is a bisexual man, and he had relationships with men. They cut out half the movie, making it incomprehensible, and still made a bunch of money over there. So I wonder if I don't know if this is a question, it's mentioned the business of the Immortals is supposedly going to have an openly LGBT superhero in it, and maybe it'll just be the same as Endgame's openly gay character. But like, isn't that like a way that Disney's basically saying, look, we've got enough backlash from American consumers and other consumers that they want to see LGBT representation, so we're gonna just give them something and China will cut it instead.
So that actually brings up what I hope can end on a bit of a positive note. We've been seeing anytime that any of these companies, this is a game or a movie or anything like that, and they're like, hey, you know what? Also, there's an LGBTQ person in this thing, so we'll look out for that. Where everyone's like, oh, okay, cool. And then it's an easily cut thing that you can take out for other markets.
It's a like a 40 frame kiss that's
Yeah.
in its own cut, suspiciously
in the background,
in the background.
of characters that have had two lives.
And not the two
But
guys
here's
that have
the
been
deal.
dating
Just the
for
fact
3
that-
movies.
Just the fact that we're in a room right now talking about this and how those things are bullshit, that's
Yes.
there. That I've announced this thing, and here it is over here, but just don't look at it. Like that, the more that we talk about stuff like that, the more that those small moments will not be enough for U.S. audiences. And granted, China's market is larger, but going back to my original thing, they want all the money. So it will push that needle. Hopefully, it'll push the needle more and more when we're all like, nope, that's bullshit. Nope, not quite, nope. And it might not get to where we think, where it actually is fair, where it actually is something that should be done. But that's where I think the needle will actually be able to be pushed closer in the direction of correct.
I like your like mid-level Matrix style hit. Like, we didn't expect this movie to be great. The Matrix was great. It has a bunch of stuff in it.
Yeah, we just need the Matrix to do that, or the Matrix, not the fourth one. Has there been a Matrix sequel?
No.
No, I don't think there has.
Yeah,
Oh, there's this great animated thing I saw.
Oh, the Animatrix is wonderful.
Yeah, it's
really good.
awesome.
Anyway. Yeah.
That's true.
Our time up here, we're getting waved on by, well, each other.
Yeah.
But no, hey, thank you so much for coming and talking about it. That is actually one of the most important things. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.